This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This season, Instacart has your back to school. As in, they've got your back to school lunch favorites like snack packs and fresh fruit. And they've got your back to school supplies like backpacks, binders, and pencils. And they've got your back when your kid casually tells you they have a huge school project due tomorrow. Let's face it, we were all that kid. So first, call your parents to say I'm sorry, and then download the Instacart app to get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes all school year long. Get a $0 delivery fee with your first 3 orders while supplies last. Minimum $10 an order. Additional terms apply.
So it's a short walk. It's actually the only house which was not bombarded during the Second World War.
On a grey, rainy day in Belgium, near the city of Saint-Vith on the German border, I'm walking towards one of the world's most unusual libraries.
So are you ready?
I am.
Are you excited?
I'm very excited.
Bon.
A special code that's been pressed, which unlocks a security door and reveals a hidden underground room.
Go.
Wow. And although this is a library, there are no books. Instead, what lines the walls is a collection that's alive. Wood panelled, wood floor, but the thing that your eye is immediately drawn to are rows of fridges with glass doors so you can look inside, because inside those fridges are jars and each one has a label with a number on. Yeah, yes. This is the library, the collection.
And do you hear the microorganism?
In this edition, we're stepping inside the world's first and only sourdough library, a bank of microbes collected in more than 30 countries, from bakers in San Francisco and Sydney, Germany and Britain, Japan and Mexico. Inside each of the 150 or so jars stored in tall fridges lining the walls are samples of starter cultures. Blends of flour and water, fed and nurtured over time, in some cases centuries, resulting in unique populations of yeasts and bacteria. On one level, this programme is about the future of bread, baking and biodiversity.
I always say, well, they're a bit like humans. We are all made from the same dough, but we are not baked in the same oven. And that's the same with these sourdoughs. Depending on where they come from, who made them, how were they made, what kind of flour is used, that all influences the characteristics of the sourdough. They are all unique. There is not 2 sourdoughs that are the same.
On a deeper level, perhaps, this is also a programme about an endangered relationship, a fragile link between our food and the hidden and mysterious world of microbes, a relationship easily forgotten, but one we all depend on.
The more we study this, the more we realise we don't know. In the future, I think we'll be very grateful for these collections and starting to think about bacteria and fungi as a form of medicine.
More from Professor Tim Spector on why we should all own a sourdough starter coming up. The other voices we've heard so far belong to Carl de Smet, the curator of the Sourdough Library, created by the company Puratus, one of the global giants in the business of bread and baking. More on that later. But first, let's go back inside the library with my guide, the other voice you heard, grain expert at Puratus, Hélène Flamand. Are we allowed to open? Or
We are allowed to open the fridge, but not to open the jars.
No, not the jar, but let me hold the jar. So
Voilà.
here we are.
You ready?
Yeah, I can feel the power. So I'm holding jar...
Now they start screaming.
Yeah, I'm holding jar
So
number 76. It's a light-coloured, milky-looking starter. It's quite chilled in my hand.
So 76, it's actually a rye sourdough. So from Denmark, it's actually an artisan baker who has been making sourdough bread together with his wife for quite some years. And right after COVID, so he contacted us because actually one of his worker put the whole sourdough in the mixing bowl. So normally when you are baking with your sourdough, so you only use half of it to make your bread, and the other half you refresh it and you put it back in the fridge like here, or you keep it for the day after. And so he was left without any sourdough. And so he gave us a call, and in 4 days, so we were able actually to take this sourdough from this jar, to mix it again with the flour, feed it, and to send it back to him.
I'll just put that back. In this room, you can go from fridge to fridge, pick up a jar, and meet the microbial life which ferments grains and has the power to give us our daily bread. What makes it a library is that academics and PhD students can access the collection for research. What's more, each jar carries a story of a place, a baker, and his or her relationship with bread and its biodiversity.
So this is an interesting one. So let me show you this one.
The jar was number 125 and was sent to the library by Anita Suma, a baker from Slovenia.
I started baking in 2012, so like 12 years already of sourdough history, love and passion, and everything started out of love. My deceased husband had his gallbladder removed, and he wasn't able to eat yeasted bread. So I started searching for other ways how to bake delicious, crusty, nutritious bread without commercial yeast. And somehow I stumbled upon sourdough. So then I made my first sourdough starter. Of course, it did not survive, which is usually the case when someone starts sourdoughing for the first time. The starter doesn't come to life. But so my second starter, he survived. So good ingredients and lots of patience and persistence are, I would say, a key to a good starter. There are as many starters as there are bakers. So this is like very unique. Our hands, our environment, the flour, everything affects the composition of a starter. And sourdough baking for me has also been a kind of a therapy. It's like connection with the dough, connection with Mother Nature, nurturing, not just the starter, but also myself. Every time when I see a happy starter, bubbly starter, when I mix the dough, when I shape it, it's so alive. It reminds me of a human. It's amazing.
You now have a backup of your sourdough in the library, and the team there are also analysing the entire collection to understand the diversity of different starters. What have you learned about yours?
He has some very special bacteria and other microorganisms in it, lactic acid bacteria, that's also very special. He's also the very first and the only one Slovenian starter. And one also interesting fact is that a starter from Canada, from the Frison brothers, has very similar microorganisms than also my starter. And the owners of that company have Slovenian origin. So, I don't know.
That specific microbe linking Anita's sourdough in Slovenia to another in Canada was identified by the curator of the library, Carl de Smet.
We do the analysis, and she has this lactic acid bacteria called Leuconostoc holzapfeli. Now, we get a couple of years later, we get a sourdough from Alberta, we analyze it. What do we find inside? Leuconostoc holzapfeli. So I am in a Zoom meeting, because it was during COVID, with the owner of that sourdough. And I say, well, Jay, we found in your sourdough Leuconostoc holzapfeli, and the only sourdough in the library that has that is a sourdough from Slovenia. And I feel that on the other side of the line, there is like this little excitement, there is a discussion going on. I said, okay, Jay, tell me, what's going on? He says, well, Carl, grandfather, who was the founder, he's coming from Slovenia. Now, I think it's a coincidence, but for them it was like, wow, that is amazing that we have a link. Historically, we have a link back to where our founder is coming from through a sourdough. Well, investigating all these things is understanding biodiversity.
Before we dive more deeply into that biodiversity story, Carl, for the uninitiated, how would you describe sourdough?
Well, sourdough is actually something very simple. It is the oldest way that humans have been baking bread that was based on fermentation. We know for sure that the Egyptians did it because they have written it down, but there is traces that probably it's older because there has been a village excavated in Turkey that dates back to 8,000 years, and they found sieves and ovens in the houses. So sourdough itself is very simple. It consists out of flour, and it can be from different cereals. It can be wheat, it can be rye. I have sourdough from rice, from durum wheat or hard wheat, buckwheat, barley. So when you turn a grain into flour, and then if someone or one of the listeners would like to develop its own sourdough, it's very simple actually. You take a spoon of flour and a spoon or two of water that you mix into a consistency like applesauce, not too liquid, not too thick. You cover it and you leave it on the kitchen counter at a temperature between 20 and 37 degrees Celsius for 24 hours. And then the next day, you remove the lid, you add again the same quantity of flour and water, and you continue feeding, and you will see that after 6, 7, 8, 10 days, it starts to be bubbly. It will have this very pleasant smell of green apple sometimes, a little bit of yogurt, milky notes, and that's the moment that your sourdough is ready and that you can start making breads with it, but also pancakes, waffles, cookies, crackers. There's plenty of recipes that you can find online.
And during that week, what's happening within the mixture of flour and water?
Within the flour, there is a lot of microorganisms present. The good ones and the bad ones. Now, what happens when you add water to the flour? You start activating these microorganisms, and it's mainly the yeasts, wild yeasts, and lactic acid bacteria, the same as you find in yogurt, but also the same as we have in our gut, who take care of the digestion of our food. When these microorganisms, they get water, they start to convert the starch into what they need for them. They start to eat these sugars that are coming from the starch. And so by doing that, these lactic acid bacteria produce also acetic acid, lactic acid, and that is what's giving the sourdough its sourness. And it can be that sourdough is becoming very sour or that is very little sour. That depends on how you work and how you deal with the sourdough. If there is one thing I know from what we do here in the library, that out of these 156 sourdoughs we have so far, they are all unique. There is not two sourdoughs that are the same.
So where did the idea of collecting these different sourdoughs from around the world come from?
We got a phone call from a bakery in Lebanon. From a baker there, he was using chickpeas in order to ferment his bread. And this baker had two sons, and they had been to an exhibition in Paris, a bakery exhibition, and they discovered that there is such a thing as instant dry yeast. And when they got back to Lebanon and told their father, you know what, when we take over the bakery, you know, you and your chickpeas, you can go. We will switch to instant yeast because it's not as complicated, it's much more accurate, there is less risks, it's faster. And so the father said, oh my God, I don't know for how many years they are using this in the Middle East and the Mediterranean area, but if they stop doing this, the knowledge might get lost. So he asked us to safeguard his recipe. And then the idea came like, maybe we should start collecting more sourdough in order to preserve them for the future. And as such, we had the idea of creating the Sourdough Library. And we officially inaugurated 15 October 2013, 11 years ago.
The unique collection makes it possible to carry out research into bread, baking, and the microbes behind it all. And the more Carl and his team looked at those microbes, patterns started to emerge, some surprising and strange. For example, out of the 156 sourdoughs in the library, 3 were found to contain a type of bacteria called Lactobacillus kimchi. When he checked back at the source of the 3 starters, he found they did have something in common.
Now the link they have, all 3 of them are maintained by women. And so when I said in the community, I said, well, maybe sourdoughs or women have a specific influence on their sourdough, people looked at me, they said, Carl, you go too far with your assumptions. But in the meantime, we have done some experiments. We asked 2 boys and 2 girls in the lab to create from the same flour, with the same water in the same environment, each a sourdough. And in the girls, they had Lactobacillus kimchi.
All of the sourdoughs held in Belgium are refreshed every few weeks. They're fed with flour each baker sends along with their starters. Sometimes the samples are also sent back to their owners, so a chance to reconnect with their microbial origins. And it was in one of these starters that Carl was surprised to notice Lactobacillus kimchi was starting to appear.
And so I've sent a text message to Will. I say, Will, who did the refreshments of this sourdough? Was it a man or was it a woman? He said, oh, I have to check. So a couple of hours later, I get this text message in WhatsApp. He says, well, it was a girl.
Particular landscapes and environments can also leave microbial imprints on sourdoughs. For example, another discovery was a link between starters sourced from bakers in Switzerland, Mexico, and Iran.
All 3 of them contain a yeast called Torulaspora delbrueckii. They are the only ones in the library having this yeast. And the only thing they have in common is that they come from 1,500 meters above sea level. No other sourdough has this strain of yeasts. Investigating all these things is understanding biodiversity. Where comes that biodiversity from and how can it influence the final quality of the bread?
And Carl, with the knowledge that comes from all this research, what then?
We will be able to bake the best breads ever in human history.
Carl stands a good chance of knowing when that moment arrives, because before you reach the sourdough library, you have to walk through an entire museum dedicated to the history of bread. Inside the House of Sourdough, there are archaeological finds dating back thousands of years, accompanied by films and images, all helping to tell the story of bread as far back as the Neolithic 10,000 years ago. So once upon a time there was grain.
Over 10,000 years ago, when humans began to turn to agriculture for their livelihood, they experimented with toasted grains such as barley and wheat.
Displays chart the rise of the earliest grain civilizations. Others highlight the importance of bread in world religions. Stories illustrated with recreations of loaves spanning centuries. Do you have any favorites in here?
Yes, my favorite, it's this one here. It's called actually the Sint bread.
The sinner's bread.
Yes.
It says 10 to 12th century. An old funeral custom was to have a sinner eat a loaf of bread and drink a bowl of beer over the coffin of the dead person. In this way, he took upon himself the sins of the poor departed wretch. And it looks unusual.
Yes, so it's a kind of a flat bread in a round shape, oval shape. And then on it, you have actually a cross and some pieces of dough, which actually is representing the coffin. And that's actually the biggest takeaway we have from everything we did here, is that what we see is that bread is always linked with very special moments of life. So here it's some funerals, but that can also be for marriage. For example, in Bulgaria, they have ceremony that when people get married, actually they share a bread. And we love rediscovering those stories and telling the stories, actually, the beauty of bread and all what it has been through over the centuries.
which is why the transformation of bread in more recent times has an entire section. There you'll find an early microscope from the 1660s, a device which provided the first sightings of microbes.
So the first one on the left, it's Antoine van Leeuwenhoek, and actually he's the one who invented the microscope. It was not magic, like the bread rising was not about magic, but there was something inside, alive, which was actually making the bread rise.
Which is followed by a display focusing on Louis Pasteur and his work in the 1860s, identifying the species of yeasts found inside bakeries.
And so that's actually Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So he's the first one to really have isolated these species of yeast, and thanks to him, to make it also commercially available for bakers. And they started actually to replace actually their sourdough because they found something which was more efficient to rise the bread, much easier to use and much quicker.
And so in this museum dedicated to saving sourdough, you can follow the story of how an edible form of biodiversity became endangered. Col de Smet.
I have a little book coming from 1778 from Augustin Parmentier. It's a treatise on the art of baking and le complet parfait de la boulangerie. He writes, I feel sad for bakers because they are rare artists, but they are slave of their sourdough because they have to feed it every 4 hours and as such cannot sleep longer than 3 hours and a half in a row. When yeast made its entrance, bakers said, you know what, I stop feeding my sourdough every 4 hours. I'm not going to continue to do that. I take yeast and it's a miracle product. It was very disruptive in the baking world. By doing so, we lost a lot of that amazing influence that sourdough has. And all this knowledge that had been acquired during 8,000 years in 2 generations has almost been wiped out.
In an age of refrigeration and a better understanding of sourdough, bakers no longer need to feed their starters every 4 hours. And around the world, as the contents of the library also shows, sourdough didn't go extinct. Instead, a renaissance took place.
So take a look at this one. This is one of my favorite stories.
And this is a story, Care, of a starter culture sent in from the USA.
Well, hello. My name is Will Grant, and I am the head pizziolo at That's Some Pizza on Bay Majalan, Washington. It's very similar here to Venice, where you actually have to take ferry boats to get to the islands and the peninsula where I live. So it's a very remote part of Washington State. Where I'm at right now is I'm waiting to catch the ferry boat back to Kingston.
Will inherited his sourdough. He grew up in the restaurant world and on busy nights helped to transport huge vats of starter culture to his parents' pizzerias.
My job as a 6-year-old was to sit in the back of our family pickup truck and hold up this giant tub of sourdough starter and make sure it didn't fall down as we drove into work. Well, this was July, and it was quite a warm July, which makes sourdough grow even quicker. So we made it about halfway down to our pizzeria from our house, a very rural setting on a dirt road. And I'm 6 years old. I'm just hugging this thing as much as I can to make sure it doesn't fall over. And the gases escape. So the top of this trash can blows off, and sourdough starter starts streaming down the sides, all over my face, all over my arms. And I didn't want to get in trouble, so I started scraping with my arms off the side of this bucket to get the sourdough starter in there. And it took about another 5 minutes before I realized that the truck had actually pulled over and everyone sitting in the front of the vehicle was sitting hysterically laughing at me because I was covered head to toe in this sourdough starter. And it's that same sourdough starter that I've been baking with for this year marks 40 years with my family.
And Will, I understand the sourdough was passed on, but the tradition died out.
These things were lost to time. I had to reinvent a lot of these methods of how I bake with sourdough, and these methods are just really beautiful, and it's a work of art and love, and to be able to share that with the world through the library is very special, especially with the top sourdough scientists in the world. It's really, really amazing.
And you haven't just shared it with the library. You try and share this starter at every opportunity. Why?
To me, sourdough starter is a love affair. I want to share. I want people to use it. I want to spread it across the world. I want everyone to have my starter. And, when I do my classes, because I'm a master instructor, I give starter away. Even when I do my competitions in Italy, I always make sure to bring enough to give it to everyone around me. Because to me, it's what a beautiful thing, life and growth. So why wouldn't I want to share it?
If there is somebody listening to our conversation and they don't have a sourdough starter in their home, in their kitchen, what are they missing? What is it that you would say to them to bring this into their lives?
Well, sourdough, the flavor you get is like nothing else in the world. There's nothing better than a good sourdough pizza. Starting a sourdough starter is like starting a child. You feed for it, you take care of it. But there are tricks to make it so you can keep it asleep in your refrigerator for a month at a time. You don't have to be like me and make 400 pounds of pizza dough a day with it. Give it a shot. Try it out. Be okay on making a mistake. Make a few, you're gonna. But in the end, it's really worth all that trouble.
Taste is one appeal of sourdough, but another, argues Carl de Smet, is health. Again, it's all down to microbes.
We know that all these sourdoughs, for 80%, they do the same. They produce organic acids and they produce gas. That's mainly why they are used for in bread. But then there is this 20% that makes each and every one of them individuals. And we still don't know exactly what these 20% consist of. But it is definitely a contribution to the complexity of the flavor. But it can also be the contribution to the digestibility. So the mechanism is that these lactic acid bacteria, they produce enzymes, an enzyme called protease. And we know from that protease that it cuts down proteins. So it helps the digestibility of the bread, because during the fermentation process, these protease will cut the gluten network into these amino acids, and as such makes the bread better digestible for people who suffer maybe of a gluten intolerance, or maybe people who suffer with bloating. Well, some sourdoughs might be able to contribute to an even better digestion.
It's an argument backed up by Tim Spector, Professor of Epidemiology at King's College London, founder of the Twin Study and also of the gut microbiome app, Zoe.
There are studies showing that it breaks down the proteins, the gluten proteins, into much smaller particles. Have all been done in the last few years, really. There's also evidence that these microbes in the starter have other effects, because as we know, microbes are little mini pharmacies. They're producing lots of chemicals, and there are more nutrients and vitamins produced in sourdough bread than there are in the chemical processed bread.
And Tim, focusing on this idea of slower fermented sourdough breads pre-digesting the proteins, there are researchers who've carried out some extreme and risky sounding experiments. What did they find?
An Italian study gave quite a large number of celiac sufferers sourdough bread and found that many of them could actually tolerate it in low doses, which they hadn't been able to tolerate normal bread. I'm not suggesting that celiacs should go out and buy a big loaf of sourdough, but this is a supervised experiment. But it shows that the fact that the gluten is actually broken down into much smaller fragments mean that the body is able to deal with it, and that's probably why it seems helpful for people with both irritable bowel syndrome and gluten intolerances.
And there's other fascinating research, I think, which involves testing the microbiomes of bakers.
Just the act of making sourdough bread is a healthy occupation. As the microbes are live in the starter, the person making the bread is actually exposing themselves to beneficial probiotic type microbes like lactobacillus that will produce lactic acid and acidify products and yogurts and things like this. So undoubtedly some of that gets into your mouth and will be transferred into your own body.
Now, the dough goes into an oven at a high temperature. That kills off those healthy living microbes. But I understand there's new research showing the story doesn't end there.
Anything above 65 degrees is going to kill off all those fungi and bacteria. And we thought that would be of no benefit at all. But there is some interesting new research suggesting that just the dead structures, the cell walls of these microbes can have some beneficial effect. So I think it's a really interesting area of science. The more we study this, the more we realize we don't know. And the way to combat that is to make sure that, we absorb all of nature and we don't try and be reductionist. And whether they're dead or alive, let's enjoy and use nature.
Back in the library, there was time to look at one last jar.
There is actually this one, 91 here. That's actually a sourdough from the UK, from Vanessa Kimball.
Vanessa is a baker you might be familiar with. She's featured in previous editions of the food programme on bread and baking and runs the Sourdough School in Northamptonshire. And it was there I met Vanessa and her starter, which has its origins in a bakery in southwestern France, which is where she spent part of her childhood.
This is my starter, and I fed this one with a white flour, so it's luscious and thick and bubbly and alive, and it wobbles in a most satisfactory manner. I can't help but jiggle it, but the smell is extraordinary. It smells lactic and sour, and it's actually rather delicious. And I think that I can tell by the way it's moving, and I have an understanding of it where I know, like a mother would know with a child by looking at it, whether it's hungry or not, or whether it needs feeding some more. And you can tell just by looking at it and smelling it and tasting it what it needs. I've been working with it since I was 11 years old. I was a little girl. I used to climb out of the bedroom window in the middle of the night, run down the alleyway. I used to think the devil was running after me because I'd hear the cows, and I'd run into the bakery and practically knock the door down. But it would be about 2:00 in the morning, and there was this amazing baker called Dominique, and he would just let me work in the bakery. And that's when I started making sourdough in 1983. And I fell in love at that point in time, because what I realised was, in the Mediterranean, everything centres around the bread, and the bread was the epicentre for everything that was good in life. The good cheese, the wine, the laughter, the friendships. The whole community gathered, everybody came to the bakery, and I just fell in love with it. Well, I'm going to make a slight adjustment with that, and I'm going to add a little bit more botanical blend in. You taste it. Initially quite milky, quite silky, quite soft. And then there's a distinct, almost lemony wang at the back of it, which is that acidity. Now, that acidity is what triggers the enzymes to start breaking down the proteins, i.e. the gluten, in the sourdough. So I can tell right now that this is going to have quite an impact on my flour. And if I use it like this, it's going to break that gluten down. It's amazing. A friend of mine once described it as microbial farming. I love that phrase, because when you catch them, they already exist on the outside of the grain, and they probably came from in the air, they came from the soil. There are some really good, interesting studies showing that the starter microbes originated in the soil. There's this tiny, invisible universe of microbes.
Vanessa has recently completed a PhD, which investigated the links between nutrition, the digestibility of bread, and mental health. And the research looked not only at the diversity of microbes in sourdough, but also the importance of the diversity of what you ferment, the actual grains.
Because one of the things that people think is sourdough is good for you. That's a load of baloney. Sourdough is a process, and actually you could ferment cardboard. Now, I'm not recommending for 1 second, Dan, that you ferment cardboard, although I'm quite sure that there's some good fibre in there. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is, it is what you ferment that counts. What are you unlocking?
Convinced that we all need greater diversity in our diets, Vanessa installed a small mill in her kitchen to create experimental blends of flour. Years of research led her to the conclusion that we evolved to interact with and consume a huge diversity of plants. For most of our history as a species, there weren't monocultures. We ate entire landscapes, and so her blends can feature almost 20 different ingredients.
There's barley and oats and rye and nettles and poppy seeds and peas and legumes. And the agricultural system means that everything is stripped out of the field and we spray it with agrochemicals and we make sure that there's nothing other than a single strain of wheat in there. So bread, as it is currently made, is actually reduced down to a diversity score of 1. This is actually what we should be eating and what we evolved to eat. And there's this magical trio of things that you need, which is fibre, diversity and fermentation, and that is what creates nourishing bread.
Vanessa's ambition for this sourdough diversity isn't limited to her own baking or even her sourdough school, but instead seen as a way in which the major corporations shaping bread around the world can also make a change. What if every loaf around the world included just a little of this blend, she wondered, along with the microbes found in sourdough?
If we can change the way that the large global ingredients makers make their ingredients for the bread industry, we can change the whole bread industry, and that's a game changer for the whole of the population to bring diversity and fermentation. And they can ferment in these huge vats, and that can be poured into the existing bread. Your average kid on the street who's going for a burger being nourished through their burger bun without even knowing it. All bread can be improved. Why have we convinced ourselves that we evolved to go and open a plastic packet of bread, open it up and have this sliced white, pappy stuff that raises our blood sugar, denies our gut microbes the fibre it needs, and increases our chance of obesity and tastes mediocre at best? And until we bring industry back to an evolutionary lens for our bread, we're going to continue to make food that makes people sick.
The Sourdough Library in Belgium was set up by Piratos as a non-profit entity. None of the sourdoughs in the collection can be used commercially, and all research is done with the agreement of bakers. The fact that it exists, Vanessa believes, is itself the start of a process of change. And so she's collaborating with Carl and his team, sharing not only her starter, but her knowledge.
And they have got a $3 billion turnover, and they are a company that supplies the whole of the bread making industry across the globe with ingredients. And many people have accused me of working with the enemy. Now, I would say that it's not Jack and Ori. There are no goodies and baddies here anymore. We have to stop fighting, stop pointing fingers, and we have to bring a solution to people. You would think that huge conglomerates wouldn't necessarily want to listen to a lady in a pinny in Northamptonshire. But they do, because they want to change and they understand that we need change. And so the sourdough starter, number 91, in the sourdough bread library represents the beginning of change, the beginning of these huge conglomerates understanding that we have to change the system or there won't be anything left.
But isn't there something of a contradiction about the Sourdough Library, an institution dedicated to protecting the biodiversity of bread, created by a company many might see as part of the problem, a business with a global reach, able to sell its own starters and baking blends around the world? It's a question I put to Carl de Smet.
I do believe that the world is changing in the right direction. People get aware of diversity. When I started in the company, a word like biodiversity, I never heard, I think. It was not on the agenda. But that today, we talk about biodiversity. If you want to change the system, change it from within. Is it doing something? Is it better? Yes, we are convinced it does. And so we push every day within the company, we push internally that thing on the agenda and that we transfer to our customers day in, day out. And if they start doing it, well, it's only gonna help move the planet forward.
Can we change the world's relationship with bread? Will the global industry be able to change? And what is our role? Over to a baker who was a pioneer in the return of sourdough to the UK, Andrew Whitley, who decades ago brought back a starter from his travels in Russia, founded a bakery, supplied supermarkets, and is now part of Scotland the Bread, a project based on providing good bread and baking skills to communities. And that's how he sees the future.
The idea of a sourdough library sounds great, and it needs to be held as a public good. So it's really important that the structure doesn't simply allow it to be raided by people to extract certain things for private profit from it. I know from personal experience that having sourdough in your life can be transformative in so many different ways. So many of us feel powerless to do anything about the so-called meta-crisis of climate breakdown and biodiversity loss and even public health, even though it affects us very closely. So how about starting with a naturally fermented loaf, sourdough, with no additives in it, and then connecting with grain that's got more in it, and it has been grown by careful farmers using less energy and more biodiversity, and then share it with other people, and gradually that way we can unshackle ourselves from dependence on the powerful corporations. And who knows, we might then find ourselves living more fully, a better life in a fairer world. One of my heroes, John Ruskin, said, "There is no wealth but life," and a wholesome sourdough loaf is teeming with it.
We need to save the biodiversity in the sourdough library, and we do need the industry to provide us with better bread. But with a little knowledge, time, some very simple ingredients and the help of microbes, we can all be part of that change. And I, for one, have started.
Dan, I want you to take some of this sourdough starter home. I'm going to pour it in here.
I feel the responsibility heading my way now, so I have this pot with your sourdough starter, which I met in Belgium in the sourdough library, and I'm going to take it home and nourish it so it can nourish me.
And your family.
Well, if they're lucky, Vanessa.
Bread is about sharing, it's about friendship, and those microbes are there to be shared in every way, shape or form. When you're stirring that and adding some flour in, just take a moment just to appreciate the fact that these microbes are connecting you to everything that you eat and everything that grows in the soil of what you eat. I think it makes you into the person who is in charge of your own food and your own health and destiny by having that relationship with those microbes.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
What's up, y'all? Janice Torres here.
And I'm Austin Hankwitz.
We're the hosts of Mind the Business, Small Business Success Stories, a podcast presented by iHeartRadio's Ruby Studios and Intuit QuickBooks. Join us as we speak with small business owners about the tools they use to turn their ideas into success.
From finding that initial spark of entrepreneurship to organizing payments and invoices, we've got you covered. So follow and listen to Mind the Business, Small Business Success Stories on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.